At 2:17 a.m., Ethan Robertson's phone vibrated, cutting through the darkness like a knife. The police voice on the other end of the line sounded official, but with a hint of tension. "Mr. Robertson, your wife is in the hospital. We found her unconscious in a motel room. The doctors, they said they've never seen anything like it." "What does that mean? And what was she doing in a cheap motel on the other side of town?" Ethan bolted upright in bed, his heart pounding. The other side of the bed was empty. It had been for hours. Gritting his teeth, he swung his legs over the side, reaching for his phone with clammy fingers. His mind raced as he processed the words he had just heard. "Where is she? What happened?" His voice was rough from sleep, his throat tight with a growing sense of dread. "She's at St. Mary's Hospital," the officer replied. "We found her in a concerning condition at the Magnolia Inn on the east side of town. Emergency services transported her immediately. You should come right away." Ethan's breath hitched. The Magnolia Inn. The name alone made his stomach churn. That was across town, nowhere near where her book club supposedly met. He squeezed his eyes shut, exhaling sharply. This couldn't be real. "I understand you have questions, Mr. Robertson," the officer continued, his tone neutral, "but the emergency room staff will provide more details once you arrive." Ethan didn't remember ending the call, only the mechanical way his body moved. He grabbed his jeans, yanked on a hoodie, and stumbled toward the door. His mind was a storm of fragmented thoughts. The past few months suddenly flashed before him. The subtle shifts in Grace's behavior, the unexplained late nights, the sudden need for privacy. The perfume he didn't recognize on her clothes. The new wardrobe she had never shown him. Had he ignored the signs? The drive to the hospital felt both endless and too short. The deserted streets blurred past as he gripped the wheel, white-knuckled. A single word echoed in his mind. Motel. His tires screeched slightly as he pulled into the hospital parking lot. He barely registered turning off the ignition before he was striding toward the emergency room entrance. The bright fluorescent lights and antiseptic scent hit him all at once, but he didn't stop. At the reception desk, a nurse glanced up. Her name tag read Linda, and the moment her gaze met his, something flickered in her expression. Recognition, maybe even pity. "I'm looking for Grace Robertson. The police called me." Ethan managed, his voice uneven. Linda nodded, typing quickly. "Mr. Robertson, please take a seat. Dr. Wilson will be out to speak with you shortly." "I'd rather stand." Ethan started pacing, his shoes squeaking against the linoleum floor. The waiting room was eerily quiet at this hour, just an elderly man dozing in the corner and a mother rocking a feverish toddler. Time dragged like molasses. Every few seconds, he checked his phone, though he knew there wouldn't be any messages from Grace. Her last text had been at 6:45 p.m., heading to book club. "Don't wait up." The casual deception of it made his stomach twist into knots. After what felt like an eternity, the double doors leading to the treatment area swung open. A tall man in surgical scrubs emerged, his ID badge reading Dr. James Wilson, Chief of Surgery. "Mr. Robertson?" Ethan stepped forward, studying the doctor's face for clues. "Yes. How's Grace? What happened to her?" Dr. Wilson hesitated for half a second before gesturing toward a quieter corner of the waiting area. "Your wife is stable," he began, keeping his voice low. "She underwent emergency surgery to remove an obstruction. It was lodged internally, and the procedure was delicate, but she is out of immediate danger." Ethan felt his blood turn to ice. "Obstruction? What kind of?" The doctor shifted uncomfortably. "I'm afraid I can't go into more detail at this time. However, Officer Parker from the LAPD would like to speak with you regarding the circumstances of her admission." As if on cue, a police officer approached them. He was younger than Ethan had expected, maybe early 30s, with a serious expression that made him seem older. "Mr. Robertson," the officer said, extending his hand. "Detective Parker, if I could have a moment of your time." Ethan shook the offered hand mechanically, barely noticing the officer's firm grip. His mind was spinning. "What's going on?" Parker's expression remained neutral. "There are some details about the situation you need to be aware of. Your wife was found in room 214 at the Magnolia Inn. Security cameras captured footage of another individual leaving the room in a hurry shortly before the 911 call was placed. Ethan's stomach lurched. Another individual? A male subject. Approximately 6 feet tall, athletic build. The footage isn't clear enough for positive identification, but we're working on enhancing it. Ethan felt bile rise in his throat. The room, Parker continued carefully, showed signs of intimate activity. Everything inside Ethan went still. The antiseptic smell of the hospital suddenly felt suffocating, the bright lights too harsh. He leaned against the wall, his legs unsteady. The past year of dismissed suspicions crashed over him like a tidal wave. "I want to see her," he said abruptly, pushing away from the wall. "Now, sir." She's still recovering from surgery. Dr. Wilson started, but Ethan was already moving toward the restricted area. "Mr. Robertson, you can't go in there," a nurse called after him, but he didn't stop. He needed answers. Now. Ethan stormed through the hospital corridor, his pulse hammering in his ears. He barely registered the nurses calling after him, their voices blending into the antiseptic hum of fluorescent lights and distant monitors. His mind was locked on one thing, Grace. Reaching the recovery ward, he spotted her room number. He hesitated for half a second, gripping the cold metal handle before shoving the door open. The sight before him was almost surreal. Grace lay in a hospital bed, her face pale, her dark hair matted with sweat. For tubes snaked from her arm, a heart monitor beeped steadily beside her. She looked fragile, weak, nothing like the woman he had married. Her eyes fluttered open at the noise. Confusion clouded her expression before recognition dawned, and with it, something else, fear. "Ethan," she croaked, voice hoarse. Her fingers twitched against the hospital blanket as if she wanted to reach for him, but didn't dare. He stepped forward, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. "I want the truth." Grace swallowed hard, looking away. I don't know what happened. Don't lie to me." His voice was sharp, cutting through the sterile air like a blade. "I already know where they found you. I know someone else was there." Who was he? Tears welled in her eyes, but Ethan felt nothing but cold fury. She had already lied enough. "His name is Daniel," she finally whispered. "I met him at the yoga studio." Ethan let out a bitter laugh. "Of course, the damn yoga studio." Grace winced. "I never meant for it to happen. It started as harmless conversations, then coffee after class. I didn't plan any of it." "Don't insult me, Grace." Ethan's voice was low, dangerous. "You didn't just fall into a motel bed with him." A single tear slipped down her cheek. "It wasn't supposed to be like this." Ethan exhaled sharply, his patience fraying. "And yet here we are. So tell me, what happened in that room?" Grace hesitated, her breathing unsteady. "We were experimenting," she admitted, shame coloring her voice. "Things got out of hand. I got hurt." He panicked and left. Ethan's stomach twisted. "He left you there? Alone?" She nodded, blinking rapidly as more tears spilled over. "I couldn't move. I couldn't even reach my phone. Someone from the motel staff found me." Ethan turned away, pacing the small room. His fingers dug into his scalp as he tried to process the weight of her words. Rage battled with disgust, betrayal with pity. He had spent years building a life with her, trusting her, believing in their marriage. And for what? When he faced her again, her expression was a mixture of remorse and desperation. "Ethan, please. I know I messed up, but I love you." It didn't mean anything. His jaw clenched. "It meant enough for you to risk everything." "I was lost," she whispered. "I thought I needed something more, but I was wrong. I see that now." Ethan shook his head, the weight of finality settling over him. "No, Grace. You don't destroy your marriage for something that didn't mean anything." A knock at the door interrupted the thick silence. A nurse poked her head in. "Sir, visiting hours are almost over." Ethan barely acknowledged her. He turned back to Grace, his decision crystal clear. "I'll be in touch," he said, voice devoid of emotion. Then, without another word, he walked out, leaving her sobbing in the hospital bed. Ethan walked out of the hospital, his footsteps heavy against the linoleum floor. The cool night air hit him as he stepped outside, but did nothing to cool the fire burning inside him. His mind reeled with everything he had just heard. Daniel, the yoga instructor, The man who had taken what Ethan had spent years building and torn it apart in secret meetings and whispered lies. The betrayal was like acid in his veins, corroding any remnants of the love he had once felt for Grace. He climbed into his car, gripping the steering wheel so hard his knuckles turned white. His phone buzzed on the passenger seat. A text from an unknown number. Daniel, I know you hate me. I don't blame you. But what happened with Grace, it wasn't all on me. She wanted just as much as I did. Asterisk, asterisk. Ethan exhaled sharply, his vision blurring with rage. His hand shook as he typed out a response. Ethan, you're a coward. You left her there. A few seconds later, another message appeared. Daniel, I panicked. I didn't know what to do. I am so kropka. Sorry. The word was so hollow it almost made Ethan laugh. He turned his phone over, unwilling to waste another second engaging with the man who had dismantled his life. Instead, he scrolled through his contacts until he found the name he needed, Jim Davidson, his lawyer. His thumb hovered over the call button. Divorce. The word sat in his mind, heavy but certain. There was no salvaging this. He pressed the button. Jim, he said as soon as the line connected. We need to start the paperwork. Tonight. Jim didn't sound surprised. I was expecting this call, Ethan. I'll prepare everything first thing in the morning. Ethan closed his eyes, letting the weight of the decision settle. It was the right one, no matter how painful. Make sure she gets nothing, he said, voice like steel. She threw everything away. I want her to feel what that means. Jim sighed. I'll do my best, but you know the courts. There's always some negotiation. Do whatever it takes, Ethan muttered before hanging up. He sat in the silence of his car, staring at the hospital entrance. Just hours ago, he had been asleep in his bed, believing in the illusion of his marriage. Now, everything was different. His phone buzzed again. Another message. Grace, Ethan, please. We need to talk. I know I hurt you, but can we at least try to fix this? Asterisk, asterisk. Ethan stared at the screen for a long moment before turning off his phone. There was nothing left to fix. Ethan didn't go home that night. Instead, he drove aimlessly through the city, past dimly lit streets and shuttered storefronts, trying to outrun the storm raging inside him. But there was no escaping it. The betrayal clung to him like a second skin. By the time the sky turned from black to muted gray, he found himself parked outside his brother Ryan's apartment. He hadn't even realized where he was going until he saw the familiar building. With a deep breath, he stepped out of the car and knocked on the door. A few moments later, Ryan appeared, his hair disheveled, blinking against the early morning light. Ethan, his voice was hoarse with sleep. What the hell are you doing here? I need to talk, Ethan said simply. Ryan stepped aside, letting him in without another word. Ethan collapsed onto the couch, running a hand over his face. He hadn't slept, hadn't eaten, hadn't done anything but exist in the swirling chaos of his thoughts. Ryan sat across from him, studying him carefully. Is it Grace? Ethan let out a bitter laugh. Yeah, it's Grace. Ryan leaned back, rubbing his jaw. I knew something was off, he admitted. She's been acting weird for months. But I didn't want to say anything. Ethan exhaled sharply. I should have seen it too. The signs were all there. The late nights, the excuses, the damn yoga classes. Ryan frowned. What happened? Ethan hesitated, then told him everything. The phone call. The hospital. The motel. Daniel. By the time he was done, Ryan's expression had darkened. That son of a bitch. Ethan clenched his jaw. And she wants to talk. As if there's anything left to say. Ryan leaned forward, his gaze steady. So what are you going to do? Ethan exhaled. I already called Jim. The divorce papers are being drawn up. She's not getting a damn thing. Ryan nodded slowly. Good. She made her choices. Now she gets to live with them. Ethan stared at the floor. The anger was still there, simmering beneath the surface, but beneath it was something else, an emptiness he couldn't shake. Ryan clapped a hand on his shoulder. You'll get through this, man. Ethan wasn't so sure, but for the first time in hours, he allowed himself to hope that maybe, just maybe, Ryan was right. Ethan sat across from Jim Davidson in his law office, staring at the thick stack of divorce papers in front of him. The legal jargon blurred together, but the meaning was crystal clear. This was the official end. 8 years of marriage, reduced to ink and signatures. Jim tapped the folder. Everything is in place. Once you sign, she gets nothing outside of what she brought into the marriage. Given the infidelity clause, the judge won't be sympathetic to her. Ethan nodded, picking up the pen. His hand hovered over the first page. He expected to feel some hesitation, some part of him clinging to what they had built together. But there was nothing, just the cold weight of finality. With a sharp breath, he signed. Jim flipped through the pages, nodding in approval. I'll file everything today. It should be finalized within a few weeks. Ethan leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. Good. Jim hesitated. She's been trying to reach you. Ethan scoffed. I know. She called me last night. I didn't answer. Jim studied him for a moment. She's desperate, Ethan. She knows what's coming. That's not my problem. Jim nodded, satisfied. Then we're done here. Ethan left the office and stepped into the cool morning air. The city bustled around him, life moving forward as if nothing had changed. But for him, everything had. That evening, he packed the last of Grace's belongings into a box. He found an old wedding photo buried in the drawer. Her laughing, arms wrapped around him, the picture of happiness. A lie. Without a second thought, he dropped it into the trash. His phone buzzed. Another call from Grace. He watched it ring, his finger hovering over the screen. Then, with a slow exhale, he blocked the number. The past was dead, and for the first time in a long time, Ethan was free.